Hello. This is the second in a series of videos I promised you far too long ago, but finally, here's number two. So each of these videos will be about a deity I have a devotional relationship with. I'll do a factual section where I'll talk about the deity in question, historical evidence like inscriptions and place names, evidence from mythological texts, and possibly some folklore if it's relevant. I've covered a lot of the deities I'll be talking about in this series before because they're important to me. I've made videos, written articles, and taught classes. The factual section will be a fresh look, but not too lengthy. But I also want to talk about how these gods and goddesses fit into my own life, why they're important to me, and how I relate to them. And I'll finish up each video with a short devotional section, like a prayer or a meditation. I think the personal stuff will make more sense if I start with the evidence this time. The name Maponos means divine son. It could also be interpreted as great son. Maponos was known in Gaul, although there's not that much evidence about him there. There's some evidence that refers to two mortal individuals called Maponos, a pottery maker and an actor. And they might have been named after the god, we can't be sure. The reason I'm mentioning it is that sometimes people get confused and think these were inscriptions to the god Maponos. But in Chamalières, in the Auvergne region of France, there is a now famous inscription to Maponos, the deity. The inscription on a tiny lead tablet is written in the Gaulish language, and it had been deposited in a sacred spring. Unlike most of the lead tablets found in other places, this one doesn't seem to be a curse, but it is some kind of magical working. Quite a few great scholars of Celtic languages have tried to translate the inscription, but they don't entirely agree about what it says. It begins by calling Maponos divine and asking him to intercede with the underworld spirits for help. The request is being made by a group of men whose names are listed on the tablet, and it's probably a request for health and healing, although some of the words could be a metaphor for something else, some kind of legal case or treaty. Like I said, it's hard to interpret. The site where it was found, though, is really interesting. So there was a hot mineral spring with a natural pool surrounded by oak trees. The oak trees might have been intentionally planted. People were coming to make offerings to request or to give thanks for healing. They did this by placing wooden carvings of themselves, or more often just a carving of a limb, into the pool. Over 3,000 offerings were recovered by archaeologists. And people were also drinking the water and making other kinds of offerings. Simple things like hazelnuts or fruit, coins, small items of jewelry, and so on. Interestingly, there are no Roman-style altars or inscriptions in stone associated with this place. Seems to have been a very native kind of shrine. The only other evidence for Maponos in Gaul is about 200 miles to the east of Chamalières, where the records of the abbey at Savigny briefly mention a spring or well associated with Maponos. It seems likely that this was also some kind of holy place, but there the information ends, and that's all the information we have about Maponos in Gaul. Maponos was also known in Britain. Opinions vary as to whether his worship was brought to Britain by Roman soldiers who came from Gaul, or whether he'd been there all along. My money's on the second possibility. It seems that the Celts of Gaul and of Britain had a lot in common, and if, as the Romans tell us, the Druids of Gaul went to Britain for training, then having some deities in common would be likely. It's in North Britain, not Gaul, that we find Maponos being associated with Apollo, specifically Apollo Kitharoides, Apollo of the lyre. This Apollo Maponos figure is shown with a quiver. Bows and arrows are also associated with Apollo, of course. According to myth, Apollo's bow wasn't really used for hunting, but it's possible that the understanding of him that prevailed in Britain was of a hunter and musician. As well as 4 inscriptions to Apollo Maponos, there are several which are to Maponos independently. One altar and a small pendant, both inscribed Deo Mapono, to the god Maponos, and an amateur inscription or graffito. This evidence leaves us with a slightly mixed picture of Maponos. In Gaul, he's associated with springs and healing, but we don't have a lot of information from Gaul. Maybe he was associated with other things too. The large number of offerings made at Chamalières suggests that the people felt Maponos would successfully heal them. They thought he was pretty powerful. The inscription to him there probably reinforces that, but it also suggests that he had some power to intercede with underworld spirits. What exactly is meant by underworld spirits is open to interpretation, but they might be analogous to the people of the She Mounds in some Irish lore. Maponos seems to have access to this underworld and some influence with its inhabitants. That relationship probably comes from his association with the spring itself, marvelous, hot, healing water bubbling up from somewhere deep underground. In North Britain, Maponos' association with Apollo could also suggest a healing role. Apollo is associated with curing disease, and other Celtic gods of springs are sometimes paired with him. The presence of the lyre points to a role involving music and poetry. But there's nothing in Britain which reinforces that underworld association. And none of the places or finds are at springs. There's more evidence for Maponos than there is for a lot of Celtic deities, but it's still not a lot to go on. However, Maponos has a particularly rich set of reflexes, deities who seem to be related to him or versions of him. These include Angus Mac Og in Ireland, Mabon ap Modron, Pryderi, and Gwair in Welsh literature, and Cunomaglos, a deity worshipped in southern Britain. For me, looking at what we know about them and comparing them with what we know of Maponos gives me a much richer picture, which has surprisingly few contradictions. This is something I cover in greater depth in my annual class about Mabon, Modron, and Maponos. If you enjoy my videos, you might like to join one of my online classes. I'm taking a break from teaching in July and August, but I'll soon be back with more classes. Registration with special early bird prices will be starting soon. Some classes have tiered pay-what-you-can pricing, and there are often scholarships available for the more expensive classes. To hear about these when they're announced, you can go to my website and subscribe to my newsletter, or follow me on my Patreon page. My personal story isn't particularly dramatic. It's just how I got introduced to Maponos, and also how I failed to fully understand what had happened. I hope I can make it make sense. I think it was 1996, maybe. I was living in Edinburgh, and I decided to take some time off work and get away for a bit. There were some changes happening in my life that I wanted to take time to process. I didn't want to travel far, so I decided to rent a cottage in the Borders, the region to the south of Edinburgh, for a week or two. The cottage I found was near Loch Maben. That's how the locals pronounce it. Now, when I mentioned to my best friend at the time where I was planning to go, she mentioned Maponos, knowing that I was a pagan. And this hadn't even registered with me. And when I looked it up, the information I found probably wasn't very good. And I thought, oh, this is a Roman god. Well, that's not really my thing. And I didn't give it any more thought. So it was a really nice cottage. I remember it had a terracotta tile floor, which is a bit unusual for Scotland. I didn't normally go on holiday by myself, and I felt a bit at a loose end, but it was very relaxing. I'm not the kind of person who's frightened or uneasy in a strange house in the country. I grew up in the country. I felt very at home. But in the evenings when it was quiet, I felt like there was noise and commotion coming from under that terracotta floor. I'm not prone to hallucinations or psychic experiences or anything like that. It's a bit hard to explain. There was no audible sound exactly. It was more a feeling, like I knew there was something banging under the floor, running about, a bit frantic or excited. Except it was just that, a feeling, an impression. There wasn't any physical perception of shaking or vibration, just this sense of some kind of a racket happening below me. Now, I know what you're thinking. I would be thinking that too in the US. But the way older Scottish houses are built, there's no basement and there's nowhere for animals to get trapped underneath the house. It's all solid. So I thought I must be overtired, or I don't know what I thought. I didn't feel frightened, just perplexed. Anyway, it was a pretty lazy few days. I went horse riding once or twice. I went for some nice walks. And after a few days, my friend showed up and we did things together. And I don't remember whether I still felt those strange sensations in the evening while she was there or whether I talked about them. It's a long time ago. My friend went back to Edinburgh, and I spent quite a bit of time walking around the lochs at Loch Maben after she left. There are two small lochs and a big one, and none of them are called Loch Maben, strangely enough. So the paths weren't as good as they are now, but the place really filled me with peace and healed some raw edges I was having at the time. I went back to Edinburgh feeling a lot more whole than when I left, and feeling a bit of clarity about how I had been relating to my paganism, which up to that point in my life had been pretty vague and uncommitted. It was in the weeks after I got back that I realized how ready I was for that to change. At the time, I didn't connect that to the weird experience I had in the rented cottage, nor did I connect that experience to Maponos. So, why am I telling you this? Well, today I'm convinced that I was being given some kind of confirmation stored away for when I could finally be in a position to understand it. So, am I saying that Maponos inhabits underground space near Loch Maben? Not necessarily. Am I saying that he suddenly chose me, tried to get my attention, and I missed it? I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that I'm that special, you know? It was only some years later when I really started studying things and realizing how important Maponos was in southern Scotland that I connected my experience at Loch Maben to his underworld associations and also to Mabon's imprisonment in Welsh mythology. I don't think our gods are much constrained by time or space. I was in the right place geographically for the experience to have meaning. And I'm the same person who later became a devotee of Mabon and Maponos and actually started advocating for their recognition in Celtic paganism. The fact that those events were separated by nearly a decade is probably nothing to an ancient god, right? Today, Mabon and Maponos are central to my practice. I don't really view them as separate entities, but I know some people probably do. I think that's too big a topic to go into here. So maybe I'll write something about it sometime soon. For now, I'll just say Maponos. I find Maponos a steady and trustworthy deity to turn to for healing. For me, he's especially important for mental and emotional health. I also feel like he helps me quite a bit with writing, especially writing poetry. An offering that I've started making to him, which was made at Chamalières, is hazelnuts, and I feel like they're really well received. So let's go on now with a guided meditation. In a moment, I'm going to share a still image on your screen, and you can look at that if it helps you focus, or just close your eyes if you prefer. So if you need to get more comfortable, pause the video now and do that. Make yourself comfortable and close your eyes if that feels okay. Take a few slow, deep, calming breaths at your own pace and just let go of everything. Enjoy letting time stop for a little while. Just relax. You're somewhere deep in the earth where water percolates through stone. It's dark and very safe. You sense the movement of water. Somewhere far above you, there's a great river. And as its waters rush toward the sea, some of it seeps downward through soil and rock, where it's cleansed before it emerges to meet sunlight in a perfect cycle of renewal. You're surrounded by rock, but the darkness isn't total. You make out the rough walls of a cavern. Sunlight filters in through the mouth of the cave. Notice how warm you feel. You're sitting in a pool of warm water. The warm stone floor of the pool is firm underneath you. You become more aware of a kindly presence who's been with you since we began. You're in good, capable hands here. Just the hands you would look for if you were ill or distressed, needed help with something. Spend a bit of time here enjoying this warmth and safety. If that strong, capable pair of hands are offering you something, consider accepting it. Healing or assistance or other gifts. We'll sit in silence for a few moments, savoring this place, and then you'll hear me call you back. Just begin to come back now into yourself, into the room where you're sitting. When you're ready, open your eyes. Maybe rub your hands together or take a sip of water just to be here in the present.